Hello, my friends. Moscow has delivered its first public response to the flurry of media solutions being floated after the Berlin talks involving Washington, Kyiv, and European capitals. And the tone, especially from the Russian side, has been flatly uncompromising. The message is simple. Russia's stated positions have not changed, and Russia does not intend to change them, no matter how many headlines attempt to repackage Berlin as progress. The mildest comment came from Dmitry Peskov, President Putin's spokesman. Asked about talk of U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, reportedly described in the media as Article 5 level guarantees, even without NATO membership. Peskov's response was icy. Russia has not seen any texts. When the texts appear, Russia will analyze them. That is diplomatic phrasing for don't confuse press leaks with commitments, and don't assume Moscow is impressed. A far tougher and far more revealing set of remarks surfaced via ABC News based on an interview with Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister and one of the foreign ministry's hard men. I assume the interview was conducted over days, not as an instant reaction to Berlin. But it effectively answers the question of how Moscow will respond once Berlin's ideas are formally presented. Ryabkov begins with a note of tactical politeness. Russia appreciates Donald Trump's efforts to pursue a negotiated end to the conflict, and Russia wants an outcome that is sufficient for the sides involved. But then he immediately pivots to what matters. Russia does not understand what came out of Berlin because what's being reported is inconsistent with what Moscow believed had been established with Washington. Ryabkov's point is that Berlin does not align with prior understandings. It is not consistent with the original 28 points that were reportedly brought to Moscow by Witkoff and Kushner, and it does not conform to what Russia believes Putin and Trump understood during their summit in Anchorage in August. Ryabkov is explicit. Russia stands by Anchorage. He describes Anchorage as a sober, cool environment where people listen, compare notes, and try to find a way forward. Notice what he is doing here. He is separating serious U.S. Russia dialogue from what he sees as a performative Western process in Berlin. He then says, repeatedly, that Russia has no idea what transpired in Berlin. That is not merely a complaint about being excluded. It is a signal that Moscow views Berlin's product as potentially detached from the only channel it regards as legitimate, direct, hard-headed U.S.-Russia engagement that does not get hijacked by European political needs or Kyiv's maximalist messaging. Now, to the crux. Ryabkov makes it unmistakably clear that Russian demands are not limited to a Ukrainian pullback from the Donbass. Russia is demanding withdrawal from the entirety of the 5 regions Russia claims, and Russia says it cannot compromise on that without revising a foundational element of its statehood. This matters because Western commentary has been trying to reduce Russia's position to a narrower concept, withdraw from the Donbass, and we'll talk. Ryabkov's statement destroys that framing. Russia is not asking only for Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia expects withdrawal from Zaporizhia and Kherson as well. And in substance, Russia is not prepared to make concessions on Crimea either. My reading of the ABC interview is that Russia still wants recognition, at least by the U.S. and perhaps by Ukraine, that these territories are now Russian. Whether that recognition is packaged as formal or practical, Moscow wants the core political reality acknowledged. This also clarifies a related controversy. Reports had circulated that Putin supposedly offered Witkoff back in August some kind of limited ceasefire arrangement. Russia would pause in Zaporizhia and Kherson if Ukraine withdrew from the Donbass. I was skeptical from the start because Russia was simultaneously insisting it did not want a ceasefire. It wanted a final settlement before hostilities ceased. And at Anchorage, Moscow appeared to believe it had Trump's understanding on precisely that point. If a partial ceasefire proposal had been real, it would have clashed with the final settlement first principle. The more likely explanation then and now was that this was an American idea. Kyiv withdraws from Donbass, Moscow freezes in Zaporizhia, Kherson. Russian remarks over recent weeks, especially from Putin and Lavrov, suggested they had not accepted such a scheme, and Ryabkov now states it plainly. Russia wants a total withdrawal from Donetsk and Luhansk, and also from Zaporizhia and Kherson. In other words, the stop where you are concept remains unacceptable. Ryabkov also reiterates a foundational Russian claim about why the special military operation began: to protect Russians in Ukraine whom Moscow says were persecuted. That is consistent with Russia's original rationale. But Ryabkov goes further in a way that should not be ignored. He says the place of many of these people is in Russia. Taken literally, that implies a belief that majority Russian-speaking or historically Russian-speaking regions belong to Russia, an implication that could extend conceptually to places like Odessa or Mykolaiv, even if he does not say so explicitly here. He's careful, but the logic he gestures toward is expansive. Then comes another categorical red line: Russia will not accept Western troops in Ukraine in any form, whether NATO branded or not. Ryabkov's words are unambiguous. Russia will never subscribe to, agree to, or be content with any presence of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory. That statement directly collides with a set of claims appearing in British media that certain U.S. officials are telling Europeans Trump believes he can get Putin to accept one Article 5 style U.S. guarantees for Ukraine in lieu of NATO membership, and two, the deployment of Western peacekeepers into Ukraine. Even if Trump has said such things, and he often does, there is a record here. He previously gave the impression he could get A, an unconditional ceasefire on existing lines, and B, Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donbass. He did not achieve either. Trump did not get Putin to agree to an unconditional ceasefire along current lines. And he did not get Zelensky to agree to withdraw Ukrainian troops from the Donbass. On NATO, Zelensky's public posture remains hard. Even if he pauses NATO aspirations in practice, he resists constitutional change, resists formal neutrality, and seeks compensation in the form of U.S. guarantees. So, when Europeans are told Trump can get Putin to accept this, I see no basis for confidence. Ryabkov's comments make it extremely likely that Moscow will reject the Berlin floating concepts, Article 5 style guarantees, and Western troop deployments. Ryabkov also reportedly insists Ukraine must revert to neutral status as part of any deal. That alone is fatal to the Article 5 guarantees idea, because Article 5 style guarantees are in effect a military alliance, precisely what neutrality excludes. So we have a direct contradiction. The West is floating a concept that would bind Ukraine to U.S. security commitments, while Russia insists the settlement must formalize neutrality. These cannot be reconciled by clever wording. In short, Russia is already rejecting the spirit of Berlin, and it was inevitable. Moscow is also pointedly reminding Trump of what Russia believes was understood at Anchorage and signaling it is not prepared to move off that baseline. The line is, Russia stands firm on the understandings reached in Anchorage. Kyiv and European partners expect a deep revision of the U.S. proposal. Russia will not make concessions on this, which leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. Berlin has taken the process farther away from peace than where it started. Europe, for its part, is continuing in the same direction. European statements repeat familiar language, territorial integrity, ceasefire talk, and continued discussion of deploying Western troops. But Russia has already rejected ceasefire framing if it means freezing lines absent a full settlement. And Russia has already rejected Western troop deployments categorically. So European messaging is not bridging gaps. It is restating positions Moscow views as disqualifying. At the same time, Europe appears to be moving toward legal and financial escalation. Initiatives pursuing reparations mechanisms, tribunal talk, and attempts to lock in the seizure or indefinite freezing of Russian assets, particularly those held through structures like Euroclear. Russia's SVR claims the emergency powers concept originated in London, pushed to Brussels through legal gaps. TASS quotes the SVR, alleging British leadership is pressing the EU to justify what Russia calls theft, ignoring European dissent, and even attempting to pressure Washington with hints that Europe could drift toward Beijing if the US pushes a Ukraine deal Europeans dislike. I treat some of that as classic Russian fixation on Britain. In my view, figures like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas do not need London to motivate aggressive policies. But I also won't pretend London plays no role in European hardline thinking. Still, the claim that Europe is credibly threatening to align with China against the U.S. strikes me as far-fetched. One SVR point is worth highlighting for a different reason. It also dismisses as false the idea that Russia promised the U.S. it would allocate frozen Russian assets for joint projects. My interpretation is that Moscow is politely warning any American fantasy that frozen Russian assets could be repurposed into joint U.S. Russia reconstruction schemes in Ukraine is not agreed and will not be accepted. So where does this leave diplomacy? Stuck. There is no clear word on what Washington does next, whether Witkoff and Kushner return to Moscow, and if so, with what. If they bring Berlin ideas, they should expect a cold reception. At this stage, Russia has made its rejection clear. The West, meanwhile, appears split between two overlapping motivations that an outside observer can see, even if participants will not admit it. Here I want to reference an argument made by E. Smith at Naked Capitalism, who has written another strong analysis of Berlin. She has long criticized the West's tendency to negotiate with itself, and Berlin was a textbook example. She notes something important. If you look back at the original 28 points, many provisions require European participation, non-aggression frameworks involving Europe, Russia, NATO, dialogue, sanctions relief, reintegration into global finance, asset unfreezing, and so on. In that sense, negotiations that exclude Europe are structurally difficult if the plan assumes Europe's role. That may be true in a technical sense, but it also exposes the strategic error. Any framework that grants Europe a veto is practically designed to fail because Europe's political incentives differ sharply from Washington's and Moscow's. If the U.S. wanted a workable path, it should have stuck closer to a bilateral Russia-Ukraine formula, closer to the Istanbul track of April 2022, and only brought Europe in after the core bargain existed, forcing European alignment with a fait accompli. Instead, Europe was brought into the room early, predictably diluting and distorting whatever coherence existed. Smith also raises a deeper question: what is the purpose of these negotiations? Her answer is blunt. On the American side, Trump is desperate to avoid a scenario where Ukraine collapses and he gets blamed regardless of his actual responsibility. Europeans, meanwhile, want a setup where Ukraine's defeat is pinned on Trump, not on European policy. That means Europe cannot own a settlement that looks like capitulation on Russian terms, because then Europe would own the failure. So the negotiation becomes less about peace and more about blame shifting and face saving. I think that is the most plausible interpretation of what we are seeing. Washington seeking a way to stop the bleeding without a humiliating collapse on Trump's watch. Europe seeking to prolong the conflict while preserving the narrative that the disaster was America's fault if the end comes. That is not a healthy foundation for diplomacy. Deals built to protect reputations rather than reflect battlefield realities do not last, especially from Moscow's viewpoint, where final settlement language is central. I will push back on one detail in Smith's framing. Like many commentators, she assumes Dmitriev played an independent role in drafting the 28 points, acting as an autonomous broker with Witkoff and Kushner. My view is different. Dmitriev does what Putin instructs, and his role is often exaggerated. I suspect the 28 points were largely a Witkoff-Kushner product. But in truth, this is academic now because Berlin has drifted away from the 28 points anyway. What emerged looks far closer to a freeze-the-lines concept associated with the Kellogg approach, the very approach Russia has already rejected and will reject again. Now, set diplomacy aside and look at what actually drives outcomes. The military situation. Over the last 24 hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has categorically denied Ukrainian claims of meaningful success around Kupiansk. Russian statements via a spokesman identified as Leonid Sharif for Group of Forces West assert that Kupiansk is under Russian control and that Ukrainian attacks near the city are being repelled. The ministry claims Ukrainian small groups attempt infiltration via the cemetery area, suffer heavy losses, and that only scattered elements, 2 to 6 soldiers, are pinned in a small number of buildings and are being eliminated. I want to pause here for intellectual honesty. There is a cognitive trap called confirmation bias. If a statement fits what you already believe, you may accept it too easily. I have been skeptical of Ukrainian claims of recapture around Kupiansk because similar claims earlier this year around places like Toretsk and elsewhere were later shown to be exaggerated or false. Zelensky's staged photo op dynamics around being inside contested areas also raised doubts. If the situation were as Kyiv claimed, one would expect clear, extensive footage of that presence. That said, skepticism is not proof. I am not on the ground. I cannot corroborate these statements independently. But given the overall pattern of the front Russian advances, Ukrainian withdrawals, repeated Ukrainian claims later contradicted, my assessment is that it is more likely than not that the Russian account is closer to reality here. A second claim contested in the last 36 hours concerns an alleged Ukrainian underwater drone strike at the Russian naval base in Novorossiysk. Ukraine claims it penetrated defenses and struck a Kilo-class submarine, providing drone footage and an explosion. Russia acknowledges an attack attempt but denies damage, saying no ships or submarines were hit and the base continued operating normally. Again, I am not the ideal analyst for interpreting video evidence in fine detail. My eyesight makes parsing drone footage difficult. I saw images of the port vessels, an explosion, but I cannot confirm from what I saw that the explosion was definitively on the submarine itself. Russia's denial raises obvious questions. Was the explosion the drone detonating? Did it hit a barrier or guard structure? Something else? I can't say. But given Ukraine's history of inflated claims and Russia's admission that an attempt occurred, I place somewhat more weight on the Russian statement that the operation did not achieve the reported result. Now, zoom out. Where are the decisive developments? Increasingly, they appear in Zaporizhia. Reports suggest Russian forces are breaking through around Huliaipol, with the Ukrainian defense line under extreme pressure. The cumulative reporting indicates heavy fighting, Russian aerial dominance, Russian numerical advantage, and Ukrainian defenses collapsing in places. Some accounts claim roughly 40% of the town is under Russian control, and that fighting is moving through central districts, with Russian forces pressing in from north and south. If these reports are accurate, the odds rise that Huliaipol could fall in the near term. And that context matters for political noise coming out of Europe, especially German Chancellor Friedrich Merz floating the idea of a Christmas truce. We have seen this movie before. Ceasefires are proposed when one side is desperate to stabilize a collapsing line. Also, there is a calendar reality that many Western politicians ignore. Western Christmas is 25 December. The Russian Orthodox Christmas is 7 January. If Huliaipol is genuinely at risk now, a Western Christmas truce is not a neutral humanitarian gesture. It can function as operational breathing space for Ukrainian forces at a critical moment. Moscow will understand that. And I find it hard to imagine Russia granting such a truce, particularly given Kyiv's actions against the canonical Orthodox Church. Meanwhile, Russia continues heavy strikes on Odessa, reportedly using long-range glide variants of FAB bombs that allow launch platforms to remain farther from Ukrainian air defenses. More broadly, Ukrainian air defense appears severely degraded. Kyiv claims ongoing intercept success, but the pattern of sustained strikes and infrastructure fragility suggests Ukraine's system is struggling. Western media reporting now warns that Ukraine's energy grid is so fragile that power to eastern areas could face long-term disruption. It's not always clear what east means in these reports, east of the Dnipro, or simply major cities in central eastern corridors, but the larger point is that Russia appears increasingly capable of imposing severe grid consequences if it chooses. In Odessa region specifically, Russia also appears to be targeting logistics, repeated strikes on a particular bridge and other choke points. Bridges are difficult to destroy, especially Soviet-built ones designed for resilience, but sustained drone waves suggest Russia is either rehearsing, degrading defenses, or preparing the conditions for a more decisive strike. Beyond supply interdiction, the pattern can also be read as early steps toward isolating Odessa and its hinterland from the rest of Ukraine, potentially laying groundwork for future operations. I am not presenting that as certainty. I am saying the pattern is consistent with that possibility. Elsewhere, Russian advances continue westward in areas previously discussed toward power infrastructure and toward villages that shape approaches to larger objectives like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Reports describe some Ukrainian units withdrawing while maintaining cohesion, evidence of tough discipline formations. It is important to acknowledge that competence exists on the Ukrainian side too, even as the broader operational trajectory favors Russia. The most dramatic ongoing situations remain around Zaporizhia sectors and the drawn-out attrition around encircled Ukrainian formations in places Russia describes as being neutralized and mopped up. When these pockets are fully resolved and key towns break, Russia will likely reorganize and then surge again, aiming to deepen operational encirclements and press toward remaining strategic nodes through winter into spring. Which brings us back to Berlin. What exactly did the Berlin participants think they were doing? They were trying to prop up Zelensky's position and prolong a war that the battlefield suggests Ukraine is losing so that political leaders can manage blame when the end comes. Trump wants a deal to avoid the humiliation of Ukraine collapsing on his watch. Europeans want the war prolonged so that if Ukraine loses, the story can be Trump abandoned Ukraine, not Europe pursued an impossible strategy. Is that a worthy objective? Is it even coherent? A Ukrainian outlet often cited for its internal dissent, Strana, has argued that a proposed 140 billion loan to Ukraine secured using frozen Russian assets as collateral could produce perverse outcomes. It could shore up Zelensky's position and prolong the war while simultaneously locking those assets away so they cannot be used later for reconstruction. Even if one dislikes Trump's asset use ideas, at least his stated concept is, after the war, rebuild. Turning the assets into collateral to prolong a losing war does not serve Ukraine's long-term interest. And within Ukraine itself, there are voices saying this out loud. Figures such as Yulia Mendel, former Zelensky press secretary, and Alexei Arestovich have criticized the pattern. Ukraine is not just losing. The rhetoric and external encouragement risk making the eventual loss worse. Yet European policy remains locked in. My expectation is that once it becomes undeniable that the revised Berlin concepts are unacceptable to Moscow, Western politics will shift toward escalation, more weapons demands from Kyiv, louder sanctions rhetoric in Washington, more European legal financial pressure through asset mechanisms, but none of that changes the underlying dynamics. It increases risk, increases destruction, and delays the inevitable reckoning, while Russia, operating from its stated red lines and battlefield momentum, sees no incentive to accept cosmetic proposals that contradict what it believes was established at Anchorage. That is the reality Berlin has exposed. Not progress toward peace, but a widening gap between Western political needs and Russian strategic demands at a time when the battlefield is steadily narrowing the space for Western fantasies. If you want, paste the next segment of the transcript or tell me continue, and I'll keep converting it in the same single narrator, cleaned, ad-free format. What we are witnessing across Europe today is not a rational reassessment of security, nor a reluctant acknowledgement of danger. It is a deliberate psychological campaign designed to normalize the idea of war with Russia, to prepare European societies not for peace, but for sacrifice, and to preemptively silence the political reckoning that would follow an admission of failure in Ukraine. The recent cascade of statements from British, French, and NATO officials warning their populations to prepare for conflict is not coincidence. It is coordination. It is message discipline, and it is rooted in one unavoidable fact. The Western project in Ukraine has failed, and Europe does not know how to admit it. Ukraine is no longer a battlefield where outcomes are undecided. Militarily, strategically, and economically, the trajectory has been clear for some time. Russia absorbed sanctions that were supposed to cripple it, adjusted its economy, expanded its industrial base, and reshaped the battlefield methodically. Europe, meanwhile, hollowed out its energy security, weakened its industrial competitiveness, and imposed long-term cost on its own population in the service of a narrative that promised victory but delivered attrition. The result is not strategic success but institutional embarrassment, and Europe's political class is responding the only way it knows how, by escalating rhetoric to avoid accountability. When British officials speak casually about sending sons and daughters to fight Russia, they are not speaking from strength. They are speaking from panic. The goal is not deterrence of Moscow. Russia is not intimidated by speeches. The goal is deterrence of domestic dissent. Because once European citizens start asking why their standard of living collapsed, why industries are leaving, why budgets are strained, and why Ukraine still cannot win, the entire ideological structure propping up this war collapses. Fear is being used to suppress those questions. The speech by the new MI6 chief illustrates this perfectly. Russia is described as expansionist, revisionist, a source of chaos, while Britain and its allies cast themselves as guardians of order. This inversion of reality is staggering. The chaos across Europe is self-inflicted. The instability in global markets is the result of weaponized sanctions. The militarization of diplomacy is a Western choice, not a Russian impulse. Yet projection has become policy. If the lie is repeated often enough, it becomes official truth. Nowhere is Western bad faith clearer than in the discussion of a so-called coalition of the willing preparing to deploy troops to Ukraine after a ceasefire. This is not peacekeeping. This is strategic encroachment under a euphemism. A ceasefire, followed by Western troop deployment, is not neutral. It is the institutionalization of NATO's presence inside Ukraine under a different label. Russia has been explicit that this is unacceptable. The West hears this and responds not by adjusting its proposal, but by renaming it. This is not diplomacy. It is arrogance disguised as creativity. The Berlin talks exposed the same pattern that has defined this conflict from the start. The United States, Europe, and Ukraine negotiated peace terms without Russia present, as if Russia were an object rather than a participant. These are not negotiations. They are narrative staging exercises. Reuters claim that 90% of the terms are agreed upon is meaningless when the remaining 10% contains the core issues Russia has never compromised on: territory, security, architecture, and the absence of NATO forces. The purpose of these talks is not agreement. It is to manufacture a moment where Russia's inevitable rejection can be framed as obstruction. This is how pressure campaigns are built. First, present unreasonable terms. Second, declare unity and progress. Third, wait for rejection. Fourth, unleash media outrage. Fifth, escalate sanctions and military aid under the banner of Russia refused peace. The West has run this script before, and Russia recognizes it instantly. The repeated invocation of Minsk is almost grotesque. European leaders now claim they have learned from Minsk, as if the failure of those agreements were accidental. They were not. Former Western leaders openly admitted Minsk was used to buy time to arm Ukraine. Russia did not misunderstand Minsk. Russia was deceived by it. When Europe says it will not repeat Minsk, what it really means is that it will no longer pretend the deception is temporary. Russia has no incentive, none, to accept a ceasefire that leaves intact the machinery of rearmament and escalation. Sanctions policy further reveals the West's weakness. When sanctions expand from targeting industries to targeting analysts, journalists, and former officers who question NATO narratives, it signals fear. Confident systems debate. Fragile systems punish. The European Union's latest sanctions are not about security. They are about control of interpretation. Meanwhile, the United States plays good cop, easing some pressures while letting Europe escalate others, creating the illusion of balance while coordinating strategy behind the scenes. This is not divergence. It is division of labor. Against this backdrop, Russia's response has been remarkably consistent and restrained. Peskov's refusal to respond to newspaper publications, his insistence on seeing actual texts, and his rejection of temporary truces are not stalling tactics. They are strategic clarity. Russia is not interested in pauses. Russia is interested in outcomes. Peace, to Moscow, means eliminating the conditions that caused the war in the first place. Anything less is simply a countdown to the next phase. This is what Western leaders refuse to accept. They are still negotiating as if time favors them, as if Russia is desperate, as if economic pressure will eventually force capitulation. But time does not favor Europe. Every month, prolonging this conflict deepens Europe's structural weaknesses while Russia consolidates its position. The longer the West delays a real settlement, the worse its negotiating position becomes. And this is where the situation turns genuinely dangerous. When political systems cannot admit failure, they escalate to avoid exposure. Europe is not preparing for peace. It is preparing for a narrative that justifies further confrontation. The language of sacrifice, unity, and inevitability is being used to condition societies for a conflict they neither understand nor control. If Ukraine collapses militarily, the mythology collapses with it. The sanctions were supposed to break Russia. They did not. The weapons were supposed to reverse the battlefield. They did not. The propaganda was supposed to sustain public consent indefinitely. It is beginning to fray. So escalation becomes the substitute for strategy. Russia sees this clearly. Russia is not negotiating for optics. Russia is negotiating to ensure that the war does not simply restart under a different pretext in 3 or 5 years. Russia understands that Ukraine has been used as a tool, a buffer, a disposable asset in a larger geopolitical contest. Moscow has no intention of allowing that structure to be rebuilt under the cover of Western peacekeeping. If the West continues presenting peace plans designed to be rejected, then rejection becomes the justification for escalation. Escalation becomes policy, and policy becomes momentum. At that point, no one is steering the machine. It is steering them. This is the central irony of the moment. Europe speaks as if it is still the 1,990 seconds, as if Russia is weak and history ended in Brussels' favor. But Russia is not weak, and history did not end. Russia has depth, industrial, strategic, geographic, and psychological. It has learned how the West negotiates, how it deceives, how it pauses wars to prepare the next one. Europe, by contrast, still believes that communiques, sanctions, and moral language can override material reality. They cannot. Russia will not accept NATO troops in Ukraine, regardless of what uniform they wear. Russia will not accept a ceasefire designed to rearm a hostile state. Russia will not accept frozen assets being used as leverage for permanent submission. And Russia will not accept security guarantees that function as NATO expansion by another name. So the question is not whether Russia will accept the latest Western proposal. It will not. The real question is whether Western leaders are willing to keep walking toward a collision simply to avoid admitting what has already happened. They gambled on a proxy war. They lost. And now they are trying to talk the world into paying the price. If Europe truly wanted peace, it would abandon theater and address root causes. NATO expansion, military neutrality, enforceable limits, and a settlement that ends the war rather than freezing it. But that would require honesty, and honesty would expose failure. So instead, Europe chooses escalation wrapped in virtue. Russia is preparing for reality. Europe is preparing for a story. And in geopolitics, reality always wins. And this is where the illusion finally collapses. Because beneath all the speeches, all the communiques, all the carefully staged peace plans, there is a truth. Europe cannot escape, no matter how loudly it talks. Russia is not negotiating from weakness, and it is not negotiating for appearances. Russia is negotiating from memory, memory of Minsk, memory of broken promises, memory of ceasefires used as cover for rearmament, memory of NATO expansion sold as harmless until it wasn't. And that memory is what terrifies Western elites, because it means the old tricks no longer work. The West still believes it can manufacture outcomes by controlling language, by calling escalation defense, occupation peacekeeping, surrender compromise. But words do not change force ratios. Press conferences do not alter geography. Sanctions do not erase industrial depth. And moral posturing does not substitute for strategic reality. Russia understands this. Europe increasingly does not. What Europe is doing now is not preparing for peace. It is preparing an alibi. An alibi for when Ukraine finally collapses beyond repair. An alibi for when frozen assets cannot save a failed state. An alibi for when sanctions reach their limits and stop hurting Russia but continue crushing European households. At that point, the story will be ready. We tried peace. Russia refused. That sentence is already written. The rejection is already anticipated. The escalation is already planned. And this is the most dangerous moment of all, not when tempers are hot, but when systems lock themselves into narratives they cannot abandon without political suicide. Europe has locked itself in. It cannot admit defeat without admitting deception. It cannot admit deception without dismantling the entire moral architecture built around Ukraine. So instead, it moves forward blindly, mistaking motion for strategy. Russia, by contrast, is doing something far more unsettling for the West. It is waiting without panic, waiting without rhetorical excess, waiting because it knows time is not neutral and time is not on Europe's side. Every delay weakens Western leverage. Every month exposes the fragility of NATO unity. Every escalation without result narrows the West's options while Russia's remain intact. This is why Russia will not accept a ceasefire that freezes the conflict in place. This is why Russia will not allow NATO boots, no matter the flag, to set foot in Ukraine. This is why Russia speaks of root causes while the West speaks of optics. One side is trying to end a war. The other is trying to survive the consequences of losing one. If Europe truly wanted peace, it would stop acting as if history began in February 2022 and start acknowledging everything that came before it. It would stop pretending Ukraine is a sovereign actor and admit it has been a proxy. It would stop confusing unity with wisdom and escalation with strength, but that would require political courage. And courage is precisely what is absent in Brussels, London, and Paris. So we arrive at the unavoidable conclusion. This conflict will not end on Western terms, because Western terms are designed not to resolve the war, but to postpone accountability. Russia knows this. Russia has adjusted to it, and Russia is prepared to finish what it started, not out of expansionism, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. The tragedy is that this war never had to happen. The greater tragedy is that it could have ended already, but pride, denial, and institutional self-preservation have kept it alive. And unless that changes, Europe will continue marching toward a future it neither understands nor controls, convinced that louder rhetoric can compensate for strategic failure. Russia, meanwhile, is not marching anywhere. Russia is standing still, solid, patient, grounded in reality, watching the West exhaust itself. And history, as it always does, will remember the difference. A strategic reality check on the Russia-Ukraine war. The past several days have once again demonstrated how distorted, manipulated, and increasingly detached from reality much of the Western narrative surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war has become. Military events on the ground, political repression in Europe, and diplomatic posturing in Washington all point to the same underlying truth. This conflict is not nearing peace, and Russia continues to shape the strategic environment far more decisively than Western governments are willing to admit. Let us begin with the military dimension. Over the last 24 hours, a wave of sensational claims circulated widely across social media regarding alleged Russian losses, most notably footage purporting to show a Su-34 incident involving a pilot ejecting into a hangar roof. This material was rapidly amplified, despite having already been debunked days earlier as artificial intelligence generated imagery. Even a cursory understanding of Russian aerospace forces procedures or aircraft configuration would immediately expose the fabrication. The Su-34 has tandem seating, not side by side. The behavior of the pilot contradicts all known physical realities, and the setting itself defies operational logic. The broader concern is not this particular hoax, but what it represents. Artificial intelligence has now reached a level where fabricated combat footage is increasingly indistinguishable from reality. Had this technology existed in its current form at the outset of the war nearly 4 years ago, the informational chaos would have been exponentially worse. In future conflicts, AI-driven deception will become a core weapon, capable of manufacturing outrage, justifying escalation, and shaping public perception before facts can be verified. Everyone, analysts included, will inevitably be deceived by it at some point. Turning to actual kinetic events, attention has focused on a reported strike near Novorossiysk involving what Ukrainian sources describe as an underwater Sea Baby drone targeting a Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine. Footage shows a large explosion near what appears to be the vessel's rear section, possibly near the propulsion system. Russian authorities deny any damage, while some analysts suggest the explosion may have struck a nearby barge rather than the submarine itself. As is often the case, definitive confirmation will likely emerge through satellite imagery or leaked assessments in the coming days. What is undeniable, however, is that underwater drones tested for years are now operational. Their appearance marks an incremental escalation rather than a decisive shift, and it does not alter the strategic balance in the Black Sea, where Russia maintains overwhelming dominance. Bridge strikes represent another notable development. The Zatoka Bridge south of Odessa, connecting Ukraine with Romania and Moldova, has been hit repeatedly using loitering munitions and glide bombs. Historically, Russia avoided destroying major logistical bridges deep in Ukrainian territory, not because it lacked the capability, but because war of attrition requires controlled pressure rather than indiscriminate collapse. Bridges are difficult to destroy permanently, and cutting them can unintentionally encourage deeper Western involvement by shifting logistics westward. What is changing now is not Russian restraint, but Russian confidence. Similar strikes have occurred along the Seversky Donets River and other critical corridors. These are signals not of desperation, but of an evolving operational calculus shaped by battlefield momentum. That momentum is visible across the maps. Western analysts who cling to linear extrapolations, projecting current rates of advance into years or decades, fundamentally misunderstand attritional warfare. The same commentators once claimed Russia would need a century to secure Donetsk. That estimate has since collapsed to 3 years, and even that assumes static conditions. History teaches us otherwise. Attritional wars often appear frozen until they are not. Acceleration, cascading collapse, or sudden breakthroughs are not anomalies. They are inherent features. As Alexander Dugin and others have noted, this is not a war of maneuver reminiscent of World War II. That model was itself a product of specific technological conditions that no longer exist. Drones, persistent surveillance, precision fires, and electronic warfare have once again eliminated maneuver warfare in large-scale peer conflicts, just as machine guns and artillery did in World War I. A degraded force with competent drone operators can halt vastly superior formations. This is evident not only in Ukraine, but increasingly across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. In northern sectors near Kupiansk, Ukrainian forces have regained limited positions in western districts, but the broader situation remains unstable. Russian forces continue to fill in gaps northeast of the city, exploiting multiple axes without fully dislocating Ukrainian units yet. Kupiansk's rapid shift from near total occupation to contested status underscores how volatile these fronts remain. Further north, along the Vovchansk axis, Russian units have captured initial structures and expanded pressure across adjacent sectors. The terrain here allows for rapid exploitation once resistance collapses, and multiple mapping sources confirm Russian advances. The Terny pocket between the Oskil and Zhirobets rivers illustrates a classic envelopment scenario. Gray zones expand as Ukrainian positions contract, with Russian movement increasingly mirrored across independent mapping platforms. What began as operational encirclement now appears to be physical encirclement, with Ukrainian forces facing shrinking escape corridors under constant fire. Southward, pressure continues along the Seversk front. After holding for more than 3 years, Seversk appears to have fallen rapidly, allowing Russian forces to exploit terrain westward. The rolling hills beyond Seversk provide fire control advantages that extend toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. While still beyond direct line of sight, artillery dominance, not maneuver, is the decisive factor. Further advances near Yampol, Lyman, and the broader Donetsk axis reinforce the same pattern. Ukrainian forces retreat under sustained pressure, not because of single breakthroughs, but because attritional erosion leaves no viable defensive depth. The situation in the south, particularly near Huliaipol, is increasingly alarming for Kyiv. Russian advances north and south of the town suggest a deliberate outflanking strategy, bypassing fortified lines rather than attacking them head-on. If this movement continues, Zaporizhia itself becomes exposed. This brings us to Europe and to an even more troubling development. Brussels has begun sanctioning opinions. Former Swiss Army Colonel Jacques Baud, a man with extensive experience in NATO doctrine, UN peacekeeping operations, and Eastern European intelligence, has been blacklisted for expressing dissenting views. Baud is not an obscure internet personality. He is precisely the kind of professional whose analysis should be debated, not silenced. There is no evidence he operates as a Russian intelligence asset. His crime is intellectual independence. This is not about misinformation. It is about narrative control. The same authoritarian impulse is visible in statements by figures such as Gunther Fehlinger, who openly calls for mass deportations, citizenship revocations, and collective punishment of so-called Putinists. Who defines that label? Brussels bureaucrats? NATO NGOs? Political opportunists? History offers chilling precedents for this kind of thinking. Europe increasingly resembles what I call a total democracy. Everyone may speak so long as they agree. Dissent becomes treason. Speech becomes conditional. Citizenship becomes revocable. And all of this is done in the name of freedom. This authoritarian drift is not incidental. It is the ideological companion to strategic failure, which brings us to peace, or rather, the illusion of it. Despite claims by Donald Trump and others that peace is closer than ever, the reality is starkly different. The final 10% of any peace agreement contains the core issues, and those issues remain irreconcilable. NATO involvement is not a linguistic problem for Moscow. It is a force presence problem. You cannot rebrand NATO as something else, add Article 5 style guarantees, deploy Western forces, and expect Russia to accept it because the label changed. Russia sees through this completely. For Ukraine, territory remains the immovable obstacle. Kyiv cannot politically concede internationally recognized land, even territory it does not control. These positions are not converging. They are diverging. Underlying this is a dangerous mutual illusion. Russia believes Ukrainian manpower will collapse before Russia's economy does. Ukraine and Europe believe Russia is nearing economic implosion. Both sides underestimate the endurance of societies under existential pressure. History from August 1914 onward demonstrates that populations and economies can absorb astonishing levels of pain before breaking. If current trajectories persist, Ukraine's manpower crisis will reach its breaking point long before Russia's economy does. That is not ideology. It is arithmetic. The tragedy is that this war has not yet reached its worst phase. The mobilization of entire societies, the normalization of loss, and the erosion of restraint all suggest that the most destructive chapters may still lie ahead. Pretending otherwise does not bring peace closer. It merely delays reality. And reality in this conflict continues to move in Russia's favor. And this is the point where the West keeps lying to itself, not because it doesn't have data, but because it cannot psychologically afford the conclusion that the data is pointing to. In Washington, Brussels, London, and Paris, the war has been turned into a morality play. Russia is cast as the villain, Ukraine as the heroic underdog, and victory is defined as a cinematic ending where the villain collapses, the hero raises a flag, and history applauds. But wars do not end like movies. Wars end when the body breaks, when the economy can no longer breathe, when the logistics chain fractures, when the manpower pool is exhausted, when public patience rots away, and above all, wars end when the battlefield settles the arguments that diplomats only pretend they can solve. The reason the peace is close narrative keeps getting recycled is because it's politically necessary. Leaders need it to sell aid packages. They need it to calm markets. They need it to keep their own populations from asking the forbidden question, what exactly are we funding and how does it end? So they float shiny phrases, security guarantees, coalitions of the willing, monitoring mechanisms, reconstruction frameworks, as if stapling words together can substitute for reality on the ground. But Russia is not negotiating with press releases. Russia is negotiating with force ratios, ammunition, stocks, drone density, rail throughput, artillery barrels, replacement cycles, and the cold arithmetic of attrition. That is why the semantic games about NATO are meaningless. Call it NATO, call it not NATO, call it Article 5 modeled, call it platinum standard. The Kremlin hears the same thing. Western military architecture being embedded into Ukraine permanently. And from Moscow's perspective, that is the one outcome this war was designed to prevent. Meanwhile, the West keeps acting shocked that Russia refuses deals designed to defeat Russia. Here is what the public must understand, because this is where the propaganda is at its most lethal. Ukraine is being asked to fight a war that the West describes as existential, while the West treats it as manageable, something you can budget for, something you can spin, something you can keep at a simmer without paying the full price. That is the most cynical posture imaginable. If this were truly existential for the West, you would see mobilization, industrial conversion, rationing, and political honesty. You do not see that. Instead, you see slogans and sanctions and moral lectures paired with the quiet admission that there will be no American boots on the ground. So who pays? Ukraine pays, in bodies, in cities, in the slow shredding of a generation. And as that cost rises, the European political class panics not at the possibility of escalation, but at the possibility of dissent. That's why we're watching democracies drift into punitive control of speech. When you have to blacklist analysts and punish opinions to sustain your war narrative, you are not defending freedom. You are manufacturing compliance. The moment you need censorship to keep your story alive, you have already admitted your story cannot survive contact with open debate. That is why the war will not end with a handshake between smiling men in suits. It will end when one side, through exhaustion, collapse, or strategic compulsion, accepts terms it previously swore were impossible. And when people say, well, that's pessimistic, they are missing the point. This is not about optimism or pessimism. This is about structural realities. It is about which machine can keep running longer under stress. If the conflict continues on its current trajectory, the most likely breaking point is not Russia's economy. It is Ukraine's manpower and operational coherence. That doesn't mean Russia is invulnerable. It means Russia is better positioned for the type of war that is actually being fought, an industrial, drone-saturated, artillery-driven attritional grind where the side with deeper reserves and steadier logistics can endure the longest. And here is the cruel irony the West refuses to face. The longer this war continues under the illusion that the next package will be the one that changes everything, the worse the eventual settlement becomes for Ukraine. Every month that passes locks in new facts on the ground. Every delay converts negotiation space into battlefield reality. The West keeps promising Ukraine a future that can only be delivered by reversing those facts on the ground, yet it refuses to do what would be required to reverse them. So we should stop pretending. Stop pretending that clever wording will fool Moscow. Stop pretending that sanctions equal strategy. Stop pretending that you can substitute moral certainty for industrial capacity. Stop pretending that the war is close to ending when the core issues have not even been meaningfully approached, because approaching them would require acknowledging what Western leaders do not want to say out loud, that Ukraine's maximalist goals are not aligned with its dwindling means. Peace is not close. Peace is being managed as a headline, as a narrative, as a political tool, while the war continues to do what attritional wars always do: punish delusion and reward endurance. And when the final phase arrives, when the front fractures in places people insisted were stable, when the rhetoric suddenly shifts from victory to responsible realism, when the same voices that demanded endless war begin to sell compromise as wisdom, do not be surprised. That pivot is always planned. It is only delayed until the moment it can be blamed on someone else. The tragedy is that the cost of this delay will be measured in lives, not in speeches. That is where we are. Not at the edge of peace, but at the edge of a reckoning where Western narratives collide with Russian leverage, and where Ukraine is left holding the bill for fantasies written in foreign capitals. And the people who will suffer most are not the men who talk about values behind podiums. It will be the families in the towns that disappear from the maps, the soldiers who are told to hold lines that no longer exist, and the citizens who wake up one day and realize that the future they were promised was never a plan, only a story. That is the harsh reality. And it is coming faster than the public is being told.